On the podcast this month, I have a very special guest. We met at a San Diego Comic-Con way back in the day, back when we could actually go to San Diego and go attend Comic-Cons. He is the Vice President of Student Affairs and Dean of Students at the University of Oklahoma. He's also a motivational speaker, a coach, a consultant, a professional nerd. Please welcome to the podcast, Dr. David Surratt.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Thanks for being on. As I mentioned, you and I first met. We were trying to figure out before we started recording at which San Diego Comic-Con, but it was one of them.
Yeah, definitely in the last 3 years for sure. It was my first con, and I know we were on a panel together, and I think I remember viscerally remembering how great it was to connect with you. And with me being multi-ethnic, a lot of folks don't identify with see me as Korean.
Right.
And it's something I never hide, but I always laugh because there's like this moment of just instant kind of like connection and joy and appreciation whenever I'm like connected with other Korean folks. So it's been cool.
Or just Asian Americans writ large, right?
Or just Asian Americans. Because I remember Tony was there.
Right, Tony Choi.
Yeah.
At the time, I think he had just launched his clothing line. Shout out to Brian McDonald from UCLA who put those the GeekCon, I think, or
Geek Ed.
Ed panels. That was your first San Diego. You are a self-professed nerd. What was that like being at San Diego Comic-Con? All those
it was like a dream come true, man. When you think about the con, most of the times it felt like it was something that I would never get to go to because one, it was so hard to get tickets and be able to afford to even go. And then I remember just growing up, seeing all the stories and the people who would show up. And I remember just being in awe when I got there. And so being on a panel and coming there, you also had this serious imposter syndrome. Like, wow, am I fandom and nerded out enough to be a part of this cool group? So I really loved it, and I loved actually being able to be part of the conversation. So it's cool to meet good people too. Did
you keep your name tag or your name plate? I guess.
Yeah, I did. I think it's my backpack permanently. I think I have it in there still.
You probably still have that giant San Diego Comic-Con backpack, probably, right?
Yeah, I do.
Before we get into your background and everything, I just want to go down this nerd path for a minute. Just, we are part of the Nerds of Color network here on Southern Fried Asian. What was your nerd bona fides before coming to Comic-Con? How did Brian reach out to you and think that you should speak on a panel at Comic-Con of all places? Because you speak at conferences of all types, all stripes. San Diego Comic-Con is probably the most unique of all of the places you've spoken professionally.
Yeah. It garners some of those interesting conversations and talking points for sure. But yeah, I've done a lot of work in higher education and leadership development and diversity and multicultural affairs. And I think we connected, me and Brian and myself and Alfred Day from Berkeley. We all kind of had just talked about random stuff. And I think they just noticed, my interests and, my office when I had some stuff around just some fandom and some Marvel stuff. And then we connected that way too. And then we realized we had common interests. I've been working with a number of esports conversations and things like that too. And so just sparked a conversation. I think the other thing too was being relatively young for my role in higher education as an executive officer. Whenever we were talking, I was in my 30s as an assistant vice chancellor at UC Berkeley at the time, and now vice president at OU. And being 40 years old, most of my peers are probably about 10 years older than me. And so there was this kind of ability for me to be sort of like that elder millennial who can kind of connect on certain things and talk to, college students in a certain way, but also connect with other colleagues who are younger professionals who really engage in their nerddom, their fandom, and use it to build relationships with their students. And so when that happened, they invited me on, and I was nervous as hell, and got on there, and we had some fun. And I think the other piece too is when you see people who are leaders in higher education trying to incorporate this identity in their work, you don't oftentimes see that happening at the vice president level. And so I just figured, let's go ahead and leverage this, and I'll talk about it as long as I can, as long as I'll keep inviting back.
Yeah, you got to go a couple of times, right? That wasn't a one and done as far as Comic-Con go.
No, I went back again. We did Virtual Con last year too. We did a great panel talking about the Watchmen, and
which I want to get to since you're an Oklahoman. I want to talk about Watchmen. So
yes, sir. Yeah. So and this year, hopefully, we'll see what happens. I imagine we may not have another in-person con this summer too. I think it'll be too soon with the public health crisis, but we'll see what happens.
Do you envision a world in which we ever get back in person? Like, I mean, I know the vaccine's rolling out slowly but surely, but like, I just can't fathom a world where we're actually like, especially a place like the San Diego Convention Center where even before the pandemic, it felt like a viral hotspot when you're walking through the
Yeah,
floor.
yes, that definitely is a public health hotspot in itself. I mean, when you have like what 180,000 people in like 1.5 square miles or whatever it is, I can't
Sweating on
imagine.
each other. Yeah. So let's talk about it. You are a VP and dean at the University of Oklahoma, which, and as you mentioned, when you were at San Diego, you were just coming down, the Pacific Highway from UC Berkeley. What was it like going home? Because you're kind of originally from Oklahoma, right? Talk about
Yeah,
that.
no, no. It's funny whenever you ask someone where are you from and where were you born, right? And that's
Mm-hmm.
sometimes two distinct questions. And for me, I was born in Southern California. I was born at Riverside March Air Force Base. My dad's retired military, and that's the story of how he met my mom. So I'm multi-ethnic, African American and Korean American, and my dad had been stationed at Osan Air Base in South Korea, where he met my mom. So born in Southern California, and then we spent some time after I was born in Korea, then Colorado, then Oklahoma. So I was in Sand Springs and Tulsa. So I call Tulsa home,
Mm-hmm.
but I was born in California. And definitely it's going to be back home after being away for a while. I graduated from OU for my master's and my undergrad, left, worked on the East Coast for a while, and made my way to the West Coast of Berkeley before coming back. So it's been full circle, literally on the geographic map.
You really hit every time zone, right? Because on the East Coast, you were in Pennsylvania and like Virginia, DC, right?
North Jersey and PA. So I was at St. Peter's University in North Jersey, just right outside of Manhattan, Jersey City. And I was at Penn State and then at a tiny liberal arts college called Rosemont College near Philadelphia, next to Villanova.
Okay. Why was I thinking you worked with George Washington?
Oh, so I got my doctorate at George Washington. That's why.
Was that the George Washington in DC or is that a
And
different?
yeah, in DC at Foggy Bottom.
So
Yeah, I did
so
my doc work there.
so I knew I wasn't crazy when I said that you were in the DMVs. So
Yes, sir. Yeah, I was driving. I was working full time in school full time. So any given month, when I was at St. Peter's, I would be working as a chief housing officer at St. Peter's, driving down or taking the Bolt bus to DC to go to my classes, and then back to North Jersey, and I would fly to Oklahoma because my wife now and my fiance and wife back then, we were in a telecommute relationship until we moved to California. So
oh
I was
wow,
in between those areas, Oklahoma, DC, and North Jersey, pretty much once every month.
that's crazy.
Yeah, it was insane. I don't know how I did it, to be honest with you, in retrospect, because doing all that full time and trying to get my schooling done was insane. And so I had a lot of help and a lot of good community behind me too.
So you commuted to class from Jersey to DC?
Yeah, it was an executive program that you go one weekend per month. So I would
Oh,
take the
okay.
Bolt bus, yeah, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. So in class all day. We get 4 weeks of coursework every month in that weekend, and then come back just exhausted trying to get stuff done.
Wow. That's wild. I mean, again, and especially when you talk about in retrospect, especially in a post-pandemic, like no one travels anywhere. To think that you were like living out of a bus and an airplane for God knows how long.
Yeah,
Who knew what viruses you were carrying with you at the
I
time?
know, right? I know. And between the train and the bus, I would get home, right? I would take my class to get done, get back on the Bolt bus on Saturday night. I'd be back in New York by maybe 1 o'clock in the morning, and then walking about a mile and a half with my luggage at 1:30 at night in Jersey City. And when campus safety heard I was doing that from the from the train, they were like, "Yeah, you're not gonna do that anymore. You need to call us, and we're gonna pick you up." So shout out to campus safety at St. Peter's College
They were
for
doing
their
their
help.
job. So talk about growing up as a black and Asian kid. I guess, like you said, you spent some time. You were born in Korea, spent some time in Southern California, but you did most of your growing up in Oklahoma.
Yes.
Talk a little bit about your childhood as a mixed race, multi ethnic kid in Tulsa.
Yeah, for sure, man. It was interesting. I tell you, I like a lot of Korean kids. I grew up in the Korean Baptist Church in Tulsa, and went to church pretty regularly. I remember from I'd probably say fourth grade until, senior year of high school, I rarely missed church. And funny enough, that was one of the bigger influential pieces on me, less about spirituality, more about cultural connection, and
Mhm.
also recognizing the dissonance between how maybe I experienced the Korean church versus some of my other friends, right? So who
Mhm.
were either full Korean or who were a mix of Korean and white. It was me and my brother, and not a lot of other. I can't even really count more than one other family that might be mixed with Black and Korean. And so, yeah, my experience was definitely unique in that way, growing up in that setting and going to church. Really loving environment, but there was moments where too I recognized my salience in terms of being Black and Asian
Right.
in those settings too. My mom was a deaconess for the church, and I remember actually one of the most vivid things about my mom, about her bravery and her stamina, was there was definitely some anti-Black sentiment that happened in the church with some of the elders, and how she was never fazed by it, and she made sure that we were welcomed and loved and being a part of the church. And the funny thing is too, I think that my brother and I sensed that too. And one of the things that we did, like many, I think, folks of color do, is we try to overachieve. Like my brother was like president of the youth
Right.
group. I was vice president one time. I played Jesus in a play. That was hilarious. I made my mom cry on an Easter Sunday, me playing Jesus on the cross. And so we just did what we had to do and what we thought was best to make sure we didn't ever embarrass my mom in that space for sure.
Yeah, no, I think that's fascinating, especially, we talk a lot about, we were just talking about, making jokes about COVID, but, there's been a rise in, ever since the pandemic outbreak, there's been a rise in a lot of anti-Asian sentiment, a lot of anti-Asian
Yes.
violence, especially in recent weeks. There's a lot of focus on the violent acts against Asian Americans because of COVID-19. But what's also like kind of the underbelly of a lot of that is some anti-Blackness, and it strikes me as kind of off-putting that we as Asian Americans like to center ourselves when in a way that, like, yes, I understand anti-Asian violence is never okay, but can we talk about that without being anti-Black at the same time? Like, I hate the,
Yeah.
you know if we were Black this wouldn't happen kind of thing, in a lot of the sentiment about, like, the media is not covering the violence against Asians. As someone who is
Yeah.
both Black and Asian, how do you kind of, reconcile the anti-Blackness and the anti-Asianness in either community?
Yeah. You got to recognize the nuance of it too, right? And recognizing that both exist, and avoid these conversations around oppression Olympics all the time,
Yeah.
right? I know that there is there is multiple truths that occur, and I take that into consideration in both my lived experience, but also in the work that I do with college students and college staff and faculty, and trying to hold space for both. That was really tough for me because when I was about 11 or 12 when the LA riots were happening,
Mm-hmm.
in response to the beating of Rodney King. And those were some of the moments where I had probably the first visceral reactions to being Black and Korean. I was literally seeing and hurting for the Korean community and Korean store owners who were in the community trying to make the best life for themselves as possible, trying to do all the right things when it came to integrating to society in LA, having their businesses torched and tore down. And I also felt for the Black community who felt like this was merely a symptom. When you saw Rodney King on tape getting beaten by these police officers, was this really a symptom of an already racist system
Yeah.
impacting their community? And they didn't feel like anyone was really on their side, much less the Korean store owners or business owners in that area too. So there's multiple truths there,
Right.
and I also lived it too. When I think about even my experiences growing up in a Korean church, and even further in retrospect, by the time I went to college, and probably the reason why I don't really have a church home per se right now was because of a negative experience I had when I moved to Norman. I tried to find another church home, and I had befriended some other Korean guys who were like, "Hey, come with me." And I remember going to a Korean church, I think in near Oklahoma City one night, and my friend had gone in the back to look for somebody else, and one of the elders came out, and he basically looked at me and was asking me questions and basically treating me like I didn't belong there
Mm-hmm.
and why I was even in the space. And that was the very first time I ever felt unwelcome in a church. And so it's real. we do have to both hold space and truth about the impacts on marginalized communities, but also look at ourselves and figure out ways to be honest with ourselves about where we need to grow and where we need to learn and change.
Right. And I think as a mixed race person too, like you kind of hinted at this earlier about how oftentimes, especially like mixed Asians, the term Hapa and things like that, like tends to center whiteness, right? Like mixed Asians are typically Asian and white. And mixed Asians who are brown or black often get either you have to like just be black or, like you can't be both, right? Like there's that kind of added pressure. I wouldn't, not necessarily pressure, but like that added.
No, that's real. That's real. At times, you're right. I mean, that social identity and the need for people to put you into a box, right, to make them feel comfortable, is a very real thing. And I definitely experienced that a lot. And it took a long time for me to process that and figure out ways that I want to navigate that space for myself. Because a lot of times I never hide, my multi-ethnic identity, but I will find myself in situations where someone has already socially kind of constructed me and treated me in a certain way based off that too. So, and I always get a chuckle too when someone's surprised. But the hilarious moments that come up. Let me just say real quick. I was on a double date in college, and it was with my wife now, my girlfriend back then, my friend who was Vietnamese, and then he was on a date with this girl who was Korean. And I'm driving, and she takes a phone call after the dinner, and she's speaking in Korean on the call. I don't speak fluent Korean, but I know a little bit.
Right.
And I heard a conversation, and she was talking about how bored she was.
So did you have the heart to tell your boy?
oh, I did. I immediately did. I was like, I cannot let him get clowned like right now. Literally, she's in the back seat right behind me, and I hear her say "shim shim hey," like she's bored, and she hangs up. I was like, "Oh, so you're bored, huh?" And she looked at me like her eyes got big, and she's like, and she kind of chuckled like uncomfortably. I was like, "Oh no, I wasn't saying that. I was just joking." And those moments where I definitely catch some people off guard, or when I'm talking to folks, and there is a certain level of credentialing and self-disclosure that is probably it's less of an issue with me, but I find it fascinating with other people whenever they're surprised by it.
Right.
My wife laughs me too, because sometimes I'll, like, my favorite donut shop is Korean owned in the small town of Chickasha, Oklahoma. And I remember going in there. There's not a lot of Koreans here at all. I remember even talking to one of the owners, and I just said, "Hanguma chukumayo, I know a little Korean." And he was like, "Whoa, where'd you learn that?" He's like, "Hold up." And then I told my mom's Korean, and next thing I know, I get some free donuts, and I'm walking out the store.
That's always a good thing when you get free stuff. So let's talk about being in Oklahoma, because as you said, there's not a lot, like at least one doesn't think of a large Asian population in Oklahoma. Now, Oklahoma is well known for having, black communities. I mean, it was the center of Black Wall Street, as we'll talk about when we get to Watchmen in a second.
Yeah.
But as someone who's both black and Asian, what was there? And you mentioned that you did have some Asian friends growing up. Like, what was the Asian community in Oklahoma like?
Yeah. A lot of people actually don't recognize the level of diversity we have in Oklahoma. While it's percentage wise not nearly as robust and diverse as either the coasts, but when you look at Tulsa and Oklahoma City specifically, or even Norman with the college town aspect of it, there's quite a bit of diversity. I remember growing up in Tulsa with a lot of folks who are Vietnamese and Korean specifically, pretty big populations of those communities represented in Tulsa. And I started doing Taekwondo in high school, and that's actually how I got to know a lot of my friends, especially my Korean friends who were doing martial arts at the time. And it was kind of cool. I mean, you would drive around, you see a lot of churches. I'm sure you probably heard this story a lot with Korean churches. There's quite a few Korean churches in Tulsa that were there. I always joked and said, how did this one become the first Korean Baptist church when the other one said it's the first Korean Baptist church? It was always confusing to me. But there's a lot of that too. So yeah,
same thing with Chinese restaurants, right? There's always like number one Chinese food, and it's like, how can there be 6 different number one Chinese foods? But
I'm like, who organized y'all's rankings? I'm confused.
Like, there's a lot of sushi restaurants that are Ichiban. It's like, there can only be one, man. There's not everything is number one. But so, like, as a kid, you kind of always identified as both black and Asian, and you were able to find Asian community. Were you able to also form community in Black communities as well growing up?
It was probably a challenge both ways. There was a lot of times where I got a lot of mixed and confused signals, right? So
Mm,
my mom being, definitely, Korean immigrant who came here and saw that I, visibly didn't always look Korean. She used to kind of send signals almost like encouraging me to connect more with the Black community, right? Like there
mm-hmm,
was times where she would even say, you're going to marry a Black woman one day, or she didn't encourage me to learn the Korean language. She would, talk to me here and there, but didn't really encourage me to take classes. I taught myself how to use chopsticks. She didn't teach me really. I mean, like, and and I realized in retrospect too, she was trying to protect me from what she saw was the way society was going to treat me
mm-hmm.
as a Black man. And I think that was her way of trying to protect me until one day in high school, I said, Mom, no matter what you say, I'm not going to deny you as my mom. I'm not going to
Mm,
deny that I'm Korean. And so I think that was a really important moment for she and I in our relationship. And I think that there were definitely times where I wasn't Black enough to some Black folks,
right.
when I wasn't Korean enough. And I think that the language barrier was a huge issue probably for Korean credentialing and kind of my connection to it. And it's funny because even like when you had reached out to me for this podcast, I was like, damn, am I Asian enough sometimes? Like that's how I feel. There's legit this idea of imposter syndrome of trying to not be seen as someone who is not enough, right? And
Right.
I've obviously I'm grown now. I've processed a lot of that stuff too. But every once in a while you get reminded of those older feelings that come up and saying like what is enough, right?
Yeah. Actually, that's kind of the mission statement of this particular podcast is that, as someone who grew up, completely Asian American, felt alien to, even though I'm not mixed race, I grew up here. I don't speak the language. I don't, identify with a lot of things that Asian people identify with, right? Like I always joke that like I don't like sriracha. I don't really like boba, you know, you know what I'm saying? Like, and then I grew up in the South, and that's another thing that I wanted to do this podcast about is that typically, as you mentioned, when you think of like Asian American stories, it's very coastal. It's
Mm-hmm.
California and New York, but it's never Oklahoma. It's never Virginia, where
Mm-hmm.
I'm from. It's never North Carolina, Georgia, which is, it's definitely on the map. The Asian American community kind of help swing Georgia, right?
Yeah.
Like Texas, like these kinds of places where Asian Americans live and thrive, but don't often have their stories shared, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's that same idea, like, well, are you Asian if you don't drink boba? Are you Asian if you don't eat sriracha? Like, now it's, I guess sriracha is like old and busted. Now everything's about like gochujang. Now that's the hot new,
Yeah, yeah. Oh yeah, that's the
that's the hot
real,
new
yeah,
thing white
exactly.
people just discovered. So now it's trendy.
I was like, oh, that's adorable. Y'all just learned about that?
So yeah, I think it's real. Even if whether you're mixed race or not, I think this is idea of like, and whatever ethnic background you are, like, are you Black enough? Are you Asian enough?
Yeah.
I mean, it's just there's never the question, are you white enough, right? Like
Mm, mm,
that's the problem with whiteness being default, and that's why we always
mm,
measure ourselves against. That's why we have to have like these are the categories and these are the traits that make one Black. These are the traits that
mm.
make one Korean. These are the traits that make one Chinese or Asian American writ large. Like I understand like that kind of imposter feeling, right?
Yeah.
And actively try to work against it. Like I joke all the time. Like I said, I don't drink boba tea, and I actually like the thing that I get animated about all the time is, as someone who grew up in a Chinese restaurant, like the quote unquote Americanized Chinese food gets clowned on by other Asian Americans all the time, and I always say like that's the food I grew up with because that's the food
Right.
that my family used to survive, right? Like I
Yes.
can't joke on General Tso's chicken and chicken chow mein because it's not authentic enough. Like what is
Right.
authenticity? It's like it's fucking real food that we ate. It's authentic enough
No,
for
for
me.
real. For real. I'm like, yeah, like that's one thing actually I appreciate about the con experience my first time because
Mm,
I got reminded of the fact that there's those same kind of moments where you're like, okay, am I really a fan or am I just
mm,
a fan? Or am I really authentically part of this community or not? And I was reminded of that mirror of how that feels in our cultural lives, right? Am
yeah.
I Black enough? Am I Korean enough? And actually I learned to try to use that as a way to talk about and suspend this notion of cultural authenticity and credentialing that we do in our communities to either accept or ostracize people.
Right.
And I see that oftentimes even in activist communities as well. It's like, are
Yeah.
you down enough or are you not? If you're not, then I'm not messing with you. And
Like, what
so,
does that even mean sometimes, right? Like, sometimes people use authenticity as a shield to expand their own knowledge base. You know what I mean?
hmm,
Like, you just
yes,
use this kind of excuse of, well, I'm the authentic one, so therefore I don't
hmm,
need to learn anything else. You know what I mean?
yes, yeah,
Like these Asian cats who like clown General Tso's chicken, for example. Like they think
hmm.
they're authentic. I remember being pissed off at this BuzzFeed video a couple years ago with like you had these like Asian millennials bringing their parents some Panda Express, and all the millennials are like, oh, turning up their nose. This is so gross. But like all their parents are like, that's not bad. This tastes okay. You know?
Right, because like they're looking at it very pragmatically, like,
Yeah.
okay, this is different, but this is pretty good.
Yeah, it was like,
And as
this
opposed
one's a little
as
salty,
opposed
but it's okay. You know what I mean? But like the kids are like freaking out. You know what I mean?
I'm like, okay, recognize your privilege in that, okay, you can now have more accessible, fresh ingredients, that some other generations may not have.
Right.
Or if there's economic disparities that you can't go and get fresh seafood, all places, that kind of thing. So
Yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
thinking about those distinguishing differences there too. Yeah, that's hilarious.
Oh, and you're right though. Like I think fan spaces are really like because it's a lot of gatekeeping too. And I think what your point about like academia and like activism is very
Hmm.
similar. Like there's a kind of even though you think you woke, there's a level of gatekeeping even in that space, right? Like if you're not
Hmm.
using the lingo that we're using currently,
Right.
then we can't fuck with you. You know what I mean? It's like,
Exactly.
but you just
Exactly.
switched it up last week, bro. You know what I'm saying? Like you can't. That's sometimes I feel like we do this again as a like to keep our distance from people and not bring people
Yeah.
in. And how can you coalition build if you're always keeping people at arm's distance? That's how I feel.
Yeah, there's a balance between this level of protectionism but also there's a level of self-aggrandizement whenever you think that I have the most up-to-date or elevated ways of approaching this work.
Hmm.
And even the notion of wokeness lacks intellectual humility. It's this notion idea that I am fully awake and therefore I have nothing more to learn. And that closes you off to a lot of coalition building, a lot of opportunities to rethink and re-strategize how you continue to build social movements. And so yeah, I agree with that, man.
So let's go back to Oklahoma. I did mention, this is the Southern Fried Asian podcast, and you're not the first Oklahoman that we've had on the podcast, but every time
Oh,
we have
really?
someone from Oklahoma or even Texas, we have to have this drawn out debate of whether or not it's even considered the South. Now, there are, I guess, various ways that people define what the quote unquote South is. And some of it is just like, was it a Confederate state? Was it not? Like, I feel like that's a, because there's some states like West Virginia was part of the Union, but that place is Southern as fuck. You know what I mean? So, like, first of all, how do you define what the South is? And second of all, do you consider yourself Southern?
So I definitely, yes, I use the Mason-Dixon line as part of it. Yes, I look at some of the historical ways in which the states had positioned themselves in the Civil War, but I look a lot at the cultural elements though too. So specific to Oklahoma, I call Oklahoma the South. I don't see we're the Deep South,
Mm-hmm.
but I say we are the South. And I think about the history of migration of individuals from the Deep South to parts of Oklahoma.
Mm-hmm.
I think about the migration of a lot of Black and Indigenous folks from Southern states to Oklahoma. And I tell people, look, I was like, we border Texas and we had, tons and tons of racist and anti-Black violence impacting Oklahoma, Texas, and other parts of the Deep South that were just as traumatic and vicious, right, as you would see in other parts of the South. And so I think that there's that. I think there's other cultural elements too. When you think about the migration of people from the Deep South to Oklahoma, that's the reason why we have common types of food, common types of interest in agriculture. So there's so many elements there that I think really connect us culturally. I can talk about and appreciate sweet tea and biscuits and gravy and everything fried just the same as a lot of folks. I may not be able to get some fried crawfish, but I can fry some catfish in Oklahoma, right?
Right,
So
right, right.
there's a lot of connection there. I don't claim to be Deep South because I felt the Deep South for sure when I've been in parts of Mississippi and Alabama that
Mm-hmm.
feel viscerally and distinctly different than Oklahoma.
Mm-hmm.
But I definitely consider Oklahoma South, the South.
I always find it fascinating whenever I have these kinds of conversations about like what is the South and what isn't. It's like a lot of times the determining factor is how racist is it. It's Like, but you know, and I think that's that can also be a slippery slope too, or a dangerous thing to think of. Like, what defines one Southern is how racist they are, because it kind of absolves
Yeah.
Northerners of racism, right? Like, and
Hmm.
I think
Yeah.
that's another kind of mission statement of this podcast, is this idea that like it's kind of reclaiming Southern as something more than just like leaving it to like the white racists, right? Because it also, again, it was always like
Yeah.
a lot of Northerners of like, people are racist as shit in New York City, Boston,
That is no
Seattle,
doubt. That is
you know.
no doubt. That is true. Boston definitely has its challenges for sure. I mean, everywhere. But it's funny. You're right. I think about the arguments I've gotten to about whether Oklahoma is South or not, and it probably and the most compelling one, honestly, was unfortunately, like, how racist is it? Right? There's times where there's institutional racism that's there, but I also talk about the importance of recognizing how close culturally Black folks, especially in Oklahoma, are to Southern white folks. And that's what I also talk about. And if you think about even the history and comparative history of cultures, you can think of a lot of cultures that are so similar but so hate each other. When I think about the history of Korea and Japan, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's cultural similarities in many ways, and yet historical harm and hurt and trauma
Right.
of imperialism there, and a hatred. And when I think about Blacks in either Oklahoma or other parts of the South and Southern whites, so many similarities when it comes to culture and food and tradition and struggle in terms of economic struggle and also access that are very similar. And yet you find so much deep rooted suspicion or hatred between those communities, right? So there's that experience of racism when you think about the idea of how we define the South.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, I think that's an important thing to think about too. Is like, we talked earlier about coalition building, and oftentimes, what scares the powers that be more is solidarity among poor whites and poor
Mm-hmm.
Blacks and poor people of color. Like, they didn't kill MLK until we started organizing poor folk, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
that's the
Mm-hmm.
big divide now, even, right? A lot of
Yeah.
these same kind of, like, don't get it twisted, I'm not trying to say like we need to, like, turn the other cheek with like MAGA folk. Like, I'm not saying that, but I am saying that there is definitely, for people on the right side of the, I don't mean right as in right and wrong, I mean right as in right versus left. It's kind of insidious how they chose the right as their political.
But yeah, I
label.
know. I mean, well, that the thing is, like, that's where we get caught up, is in these binaries
Yeah.
that we can easily dissect society so quickly when it's far more complicated and far more nuanced. And I know I try to think about this in so many different ways. There's realities of radical conservatives who've taken on really, really violent actions towards minorities and marginalized communities and immigrant communities, et cetera. But I also try to think about, okay, where do we need to try to continue to hold space for those people who just don't know better?
Right.
There's a lot of folks like that in Oklahoma who have voted party line, who I also know would give the shirts off their backs to help me, who probably voted for Trump. I purposely don't talk about it because I just there's moments with some friends who I know that their historical political leanings are, and I just don't ask them whether they voted for Trump. But there are people who I've come to my family's aid many times, and so there's a reality that I think I do try to think as critically as possible and try to humanize people and not get too caught up in the binaries. But it's hard. It's really
Yeah, no,
hard.
right. It's definitely hard. And again, I'm not trying to say, because oftentimes we're always trying to worry about, like, white folks' feelings, right? Which is
Mhm.
ironic, since they're the fuck your feelings crayon. But like, whatever, but like, every time Trump, loses an election, there's like 20 articles in the New York Times about, like, what do the Trump voters, how do they feel about it? But at the same time, I will say that, like, and maybe this is a different perspective as people who grew up in, like, predominantly white spaces, or grew up in, like, the South, and having a just different perspective. And, like, we talk about bubbles a lot of times, like, you're in an academic bubble, or you're in, like, this liberal bubble, or you're in this conservative
Yeah.
Fox News bubble, and, like, they're all varying degrees of disinformation that comes through, especially, like, depending on what bubble you're in. And I feel like, and I'm not trying to say, like, I know more. I'm not trying to say I'm more woke than everybody, but I feel like I have insight into, like, a lot of different views. And this kind of
Yeah.
this is a long way of going around to, like, our first conversation about what is authentic, right? And really, it's not about how much do you conform to these particular personality traits. To me, it's just like, true authenticity is just being who you are, being yourself,
Right.
and whatever that
Right.
means, and that might be a simple way of putting it, but it's like, I think about this especially in like creative spaces when we're all trying to like, how do we tell an authentic Asian American story? How do we tell an authentic African American story? And sometimes I feel like what we lose when we think in those kind of like generic terms is like the human story. Like if we can make this character a human being, then that is an authentic Black story. That is an authentic Asian story, right? Because again, the only folks who get to do that are white people, right? And it's not, you're not being white when you get to be yourself. You're just being yourself. It's just, we just provide that space to white people to kind of encompass whatever they want to be, while we all sit over here having to like conform to particular traits that or characteristics that say this is what a Black person is, this is what an Asian person is.
Yeah, no, that's true, man. And a lot of times when our stories are told, it's shaped in a way of some sort of exceptionalism or some sort of
or pain, right? Like
yeah,
how many stories, how many Black stories have to be about trauma and pain and not stories of joy and happiness? Like
oh God, yeah, yes,
like
absolutely.
One More Slave movie that's to win an Oscar is like, right. You know what I'm saying? Like it's just kind of
no. No, that's real, man. And I think that's probably where there's this strange fear too. And you're right. There's a lot of people who are afraid of actually exploring those emotions. And actually, that's what I appreciate about some of the recent, stuff coming out between Watchmen or Lovecraft Country, is that it actually really presents stories of both flawed people and flawed history, and reminders that we should celebrate joy in the things that we've accomplished, but we should also have an awareness of the things that we've done that have harmed others, and do the best we can to always try to rectify that. And that's what I think is the human condition, that none of us are perfect.
Right.
We have all been engaged in certain things that we should be proud of and things that we should be ashamed of, and try to work to correct that and restore that harm.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up Watchmen in particular, because I wanted to ask you, as I didn't get to attend the panel that you did for the virtual Comic-Con last year, but as someone who grew up in Tulsa, Oklahoma, as a Black man, as a Black and Asian man, since Asian characters were also featured prominently in the show, what was it like for you to watch? And as a nerd, right, as a self-professed nerd, comics nerd, what was it like for you to experience the HBO adaptation of Watchmen as it aired?
Yeah, I was captivated immediately, and then I was shocked when you saw history put in the place of pop culture the way that was. I remember when I first saw the previews for it, and I remember texting actually a colleague of mine who's the chair of our African American Studies department here at Oklahoma. And I said, have you seen this? This is a game changer. And then I remember actually talking to a few other kind of fellow geeks about it too, including Al Day. And I said, this is going to change a lot of ways we talk about this. And it's not new information for Black folks from Oklahoma and in Tulsa specifically.
Right.
But it was a awakening for a lot of people who had never heard this story nor understood the impacts on the community and what this meant for us as a nation. So yeah, it meant a lot to see that, and actually to see that it was done well, right? Because you see so many things that are not backed either financially or politically or otherwise, and they just don't get the support. But to see someone like Regina King just shine in this movie, and then be connected to pop culture fandom like the Watchmen, that turns real historical events on its head a little bit and really makes us look at it from a different lens, and then plopping in these fantastic characters and superheroes in there, it creates a sense of accessibility that I really appreciate.
And I think a sense of ownership too, right? Because like so many comic book stories, in particular superhero stories, are rooted in some sort of real world situation, but it just happens to be like, again, what we're saying, like the default whiteness, right? Like we talk about the Nazis, like Magneto was a product of the concentration camps, right? Or the Captain America punching a Nazi in his first appearance, right? Like those, which is funny because so many racist nerds always talk about get politics out of comics. It's like,
it's been there.
Have you seen Captain America #1 in 1945? But actually, having, like, I think what was powerful about Watchmen was that it was able to like root it in Black history, right? Like there aren't enough heroes that come from like communities of color that are really rooted in their communities, because oftentimes they're created by white folks who were kind of like
Yeah.
exploiting, like, you know, he just happens to be from the jungle or whatever. Like it's never,
Right.
it's never nuanced. And I think that was one of the things that they were able to do, is to tell a story rooted in real historical precedent, but also not feel exploitative at the same time.
Yeah, and the themes that came out were incredible to me too. And that was a part of our talk with the Comic-Con panel, was the basis of the characters that were created, right? We had characters that were born of trauma, who were born of fear, and I guess in some ways made the fear useful, but also you saw how tortured they were
Mm-hmm.
in terms of both Regina King and her father's character too. So yeah, it just created a lot more authenticity and nuance there, and that you have trouble getting at the heart of it when you are someone who doesn't identify with that community, and you're trying to create these characters. I mean, that's why I love Stan Lee. I loved Gene Roddenberry for what he did with Star Trek, and these were folks who were trying
Mm-hmm.
to really highlight ills of society and actually talk about what an idealized society could look like. But yeah, there's going to be flaws in that too, because
Right.
they may not fully understand
You don't know what you
what
don't
it
know, right?
means. Yeah, exactly, man.
And I think, just to put a button on the Watchmen thing, I think what also was fascinating, and I don't even want to call it subversive, because it kind of, that has a negative connotation, I feel, but like the way that they were able to recontextualize two actual characters from the original comic, Dr. Manhattan and Hooded Justice, who were ostensibly
Hmm.
white characters. Or they weren't necessarily, well, maybe Dr. Manhattan was, because we saw what he looked like before he became Dr.
Yeah,
Manhattan, but like Hooded Justice
yeah,
was never shown in
right.
the comics, but they were able to recontextualize those two characters specifically as black. And I think,
Hmm.
you know, again, in a postmodern way, it talks about like the ability to recast these like traditionally white characters with people of color, and that's a controversy
Hmm.
that continues to happen to this day. Like John Boyega got so much shit for playing a black stormtrooper, or like, you know, the idea of having like an Asian American Iron Fist or whatever. Like all of these stupid controversies that so many less woke folks in fandom complain about was again handled so brilliantly on Watchmen, and it was commenting
Yeah,
on that, I think, as well.
yeah, and I think even with Dr. Manhattan, that was a subtle reminder of how fragile the social constructs are of race,
Mm-hmm.
and how we need to not worry so much about that as well in some context too. So yeah, I agree.
So Dave, last thing I want to talk to you about, and this is a recurring segment on the podcast, as a fellow Southerner, as a fellow Asian American, the one thing that both communities, I think, have a deep abiding love for is food. And I'm not too familiar with like the delicacies of Oklahoma cuisine. I do know like
Uh,
there are like onion smash burgers that look pretty delicious, so that when I see
yeah.
like videos on YouTube, I've never actually had one, but is there a particular dish that when you weren't in Oklahoma, when you like graduated and went off to like Pennsylvania or New Jersey, or when you
Yeah.
lived in Berkeley, was there something that you were like, man, I can't wait to go back to Tulsa, and as soon as you came back to Oklahoma was like the first thing you had to eat?
I think definitely not a delicacy, but really good for me was just a good burger from Braum's was like the first thing I would always pick up when I came back to Oklahoma. And I'd probably eat it way too much during the holidays when I come visit. And I would get a slushy from QuickTrip. Folks from Oklahoma know QuickTrip is like the place. And people in Pennsylvania talk about like Wawa,
Wawa, right?
or they'll talk about Sheets or whatever.
Bucky's in Texas.
Yeah, Bucky's in Texas. Yep. But QT, QuickTrip in Oklahoma was the stuff, man. So I would definitely hit that up when I came back to visit for sure.
Nice.
That and a fat Brahms burger with bacon.
Are the Brahms burgers? Are they like the onion ones? Like I've only seen the onion burgers from there.
So I will tell you no, but the other stop though that I would hit up would be Pawpaw's Burgers, which is like old style fried onion burgers, really just really greasy, all the good stuff
It looks
at
good.
Pawpaw's in Chickasha, Oklahoma for sure. And then the requisite barbecue, right? Just getting whatever barbecue
Wait,
in
Oklahoma got barbecue
ridiculously.
too?
Yes, sir. Yes. Fried catfish and barbecue. Now, I am not a barbecue snob. I admit I just eat barbecue in general. Some people can talk about like the difference in certain types of ways to prepare it.
Right, right,
I
right.
don't go that level of detail, but I just know that Oklahoma is known for not only really good just quality beef, but portions that are so entirely unhealthy that you can't help yourself and eat a whole lot of food.
Now, is Oklahoma barbecue, does it lean more, because I'm not being facetious, I didn't realize Oklahoma had its own, I apologize if I offended, but like, does it lean towards the sweet, the tangy, the mustardy, the vinegary? Like, where does the Oklahoma barbecue lay on that spectrum?
Probably the vinegary spectrum, closer to that. I don't not really experience a lot of sweet barbecue kind of flavors and spices in Oklahoma for sure. Yeah.
Okay, cool. I might need to go next. Well, if I ever travel again, if I ever leave my home and have to swing by Oklahoma, I definitely want to get a Braum's burger. You make it sound delicious.
Yeah, you need to come through.
Pawpaw sounds good too.
Yeah, Pawpaws. Hit up Pawpaws. That's probably more uniquely Oklahoman. Braum's is definitely Oklahoma regionally, and I think there's some Braum stores maybe in Texas too, but mainly it's in Oklahoma. The quality of the beef I just always appreciate, and good portion sizes too. So, and the cool thing about being Asian and growing up in the South too is that you. At least for me, I had the pleasure of having great home cooked meals from my mom.
Right.
She would oftentimes try to work with stuff that would actually be good for both, my dad too. So very traditional gendered roles where she cooked and she managed the kitchen and everyone stayed out. And she would oftentimes make American meals and Korean meals. And my fat behind would eat both because that's what I wanted to do. And so I got the good stuff on both sides in many ways. Got to eat a lot of great American food, and I got to have my my bulgogi, I had my kimchi, I had my rice, and I loved it.
How often did people make the soul food joke in your home growing up?
Not in my home, but I caught that when I got to college. I got folks who were like, "Yo, like you eat watermelon with chopsticks?" I'm like, "Yo, why are we going there right now?" And then there was those random jokes. We just messed with each other all the time in college. But yeah, definitely got those types of comments and jokes for sure.
Because that would be, I mean, no lie, I feel like that would be a dope like fusion restaurant, like soul food, SEOUL, but like making like traditional Southern dishes, but with like Korean ingredients.
Yeah, there's a cat I think in Philadelphia I think his background was Korean and Jamaican. I feel like there's a restaurant that might have some type of leaning towards those flavors of kind of Caribbean, Black Caribbean and Korean or Asian dishes. And so if I find it, I'll have to let you know.
Oh yeah. And then Philadelphia, I can actually get to Philadelphia from where I live, so I might actually have to do that. Well, Dr. Surratt, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast. It has been a pleasure talking to you. It's nice connecting. We haven't seen each other in a couple of years, so
yeah.
If other folks want to connect with you on the internet, how can they find you?
Oh yeah, my Twitter and Instagram are open, so it's Dr. David Surratt. You can find me on Twitter and Instagram easily. I reserve Facebook for friends and folks I've met in real life and that kind of thing, but definitely I get to meet a lot of great people, especially on Twitter. And private messages are open as well, just to connect with people. It's been great.
All right. Well, again, it's been a pleasure. Thanks so much.
Hey, thank you, brother. Appreciate you.
All right. Big thanks to Dr. David Surratt. Thank you for listening. You can find me, Keith Chow, on Twitter at @TheRealChow, _real_Chow. Follow the podcast at Southern Asians on Twitter and at Southern Fried Asians on Instagram. Go to hardknockmedia.com to find this and all of the podcasts in the Hard Knock Media Network. Subscribe and download Apple Podcasts, Google Play Music, Stitcher, Spotify, anywhere you get podcasts. Support us on patreon.com/thenerdscolor. Also find us on GoFundMe. As always, Southern Fried Asian is co-produced by Jess Vu. Email us, thenerdscolor@gmail.com. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, youtube.com/thenerdscolor. And until next time, keep it Southern Fried, y'all.